In the last 2 years I sailed from the Abacos, the west of the Bahamas, all the way to the east of the Bahamas, visiting many of the Bahamian islands, then continued to anchorages in the Turks and Caicos, then to the Dominican Republic, continuing through the Mona Passage to the west coast of Puerto Rico, then to the east coast of Puerto Rico and onwards to the East Caribbean. All of this on my 50-year-old 30-foot sailboat. Every sailor who sailed from the east coast of the USA towards the East Caribbean has read this book, The Gentleman's Guide to Passages South. When I started this trip as a beginner sailor, there were many things in this book that I did not quite understand. Partly because of the terminology that is sometimes used that only a more experienced sailor understands, and partly because it's written a few decades ago and a big part will always stay correct. Also a big part is quite outdated and I couldn't differentiate at the time what I should really know and what not. In this video I'm talking you through my actual journey plus much of the knowledge from this book, which I do understand now after having done this trip. And besides this, the parts of the book that I still had trouble with, I have discussed with the author Bruce Van Sant himself. Bruce is currently 85 years old and lives in the Dominican Republic. I'm very grateful to have had his help on this project. I made this video in the hope that the person who I was when I started out also understands all what is said in this book before starting out, as it would have been a big help to me. When I started out, I have followed routes of friends of mine and it has been a great help to me to get familiar with how cruising through the islands works. Especially I've used routes of friends for getting into new anchorages. Now I would like to return the favor by helping you on your way. It is not my intention to tell you where you should or should not go. I am simply trying to help you on your way by either giving you a visual image of how this trip could be done, or by having you doing my route until you are comfortable enough to change some of my destinations for some other destinations of your preference. You can download the route that I'm showing you in the description of this video. You can use it for practice purposes, or you're welcome to use it for your own navigation. I've done my very best to make it as accurate as possible. Of course, I cannot be held liable for any mistakes. You can either click on the links in the description of this video and see it for free on the Navionics website, or you can download the GPX files and import the route to whatever chart plotter you use. You can look at the route while you watch this video or keep it for your future. Before doing this trip, I had 1 year of crewing experience on a variety of different boats and then bought my own boat. And now I have 2 years of full-time, mostly solo, cruising experience on my own boat. During the journey from the West Bahamas to the East Caribbean that we're going to talk about, besides talking about theory from this book that I think you should know, I will also talk about where I got drinking water, did laundry, the availability of parts on the way, how I ship parts to different islands, etc. Before we start with the actual sailing journey, there are a few things I need to explain. This book is called The Gentleman's Guide to Passages South, with subtitle The Thornless Path to Windward. What does that mean, the thornless path to windward? The prevailing or general wind and current direction most days of the year between the East USA and the beginning of the East Caribbean is from the east-southeast towards the west. Meaning it is very easy to sail with your boat from the east, where the East Caribbean is, towards the west, where the USA is, because the wind and waves are pushing you there. But quite a challenge to sail in the opposite direction. Sailing to windward means that we are sailing in a direction where the prevailing wind is coming from. Why would we do this if it's so difficult? Well, because you live in the States and you want to see the East Caribbean, for an example. This video is about how to be as comfortable as possible doing this trip. Looking at it from the bright side, if you start out this trip and you find it too tough, you can always turn around and you have an easy ride back. This route is generally referred to as the Thorny path, meaning a difficult and challenging route. As Bruce tried to take the thorns out of it, he called it the thornless path to windward. I just released another video on how to sail the East Caribbean. One of the differences between sailing the East Caribbean and a trip from the USA towards the East Caribbean is timing. Hurricane season in the Caribbean runs from the 1st of June until the 1st of December. unless you decide to spend hurricane season in a hurricane hole like Luperon in the Dominican Republic, or unless you take the boat out of the water and strap it down for hurricane season. Ideally, during hurricane season, you want to be under about St. Vincent. When you are sailing in the East Caribbean and it's getting closer to June, even though you might not immediately get a perfect window to sail south, there will be a lot of weather windows that make it possible for you to somewhat easy sail south to the safer region, because with a general or prevailing northeast, east or southeast wind, which is the prevailing wind direction in the East Caribbean, it is not very difficult to find a weather window to sail south. But when you're doing the trip from the USA through the Caribbean islands to the East Caribbean, you're most of the time going almost straight east, which is difficult because a boat cannot sail straight into the wind. And getting a weather window that allows you to comfortably sail straight east does not happen a lot. But still, before hurricane season starts, you want to either be out of this region or in one of the hurricane holes, and that is why timing becomes extremely important when doing this trip. If you wonder why it is called the Gentleman's Guide, it's because there's an old expression saying, gentlemen don't sail to windward. Why do gentlemen don't sail to windward? It's because when you sail towards the wind, the boat heels over more, and there's more stress on the boat, and thus the boat will break faster. Besides that, because you cannot sail straight into the wind, if the wind is coming directly from where you want to go, you have to tack back and forth, and doing this over a long distance will add a lot of miles. The title of this book refers to how to be a gentleman, meaning being comfortable and happy, and at the same time sail to windwards, the direction where the prevailing or general wind is coming from. About the author, Bruce Vincent, he spent about 20 years sailing the Caribbean, mostly single-handed, like myself. The writing of this book began in 1978, and although the general weather pattern hasn't changed much, one important change from the time this book was written was that the technology was a lot more minimal. I'm especially talking about internet and how easy it is these days to get weather forecasts, and also how much weather forecasts have improved in the last 40 years. One of the things I found really interesting is how he talks about that before the age of steam, this route had little traffic because people who owned sailboats just didn't want to do it. And that should say something about the potential difficulty of this trip. Over time, sailboats have improved. For an example, boats built in the last 50 years or so sail a lot better towards the wind compared to those ancient boats. However, that does not mean that because the boat can do it, it will also be comfortable. In the book, he describes how islands, big and small, change the effect of the prevailing or general wind direction and current, and we can use this to our advantage. We're going to talk about this a lot more later. As he says in his book, this is a guide for when and how to go. It is not a cruising guide. He has recommendations for cruising guides. These days, because we have internet basically everywhere we go, besides cruising guides, I mostly use the app Navily, which is free. You can zoom into a place and read reviews of other people. And a similar app is No Foreign Land. I will give more examples of the use of these apps while we are doing our sailing trip. This video is for anyone who would describe themselves as cruiser, not as racer. Racer goes out of the harbor with an empty boat and tries to get the most speed out of the boat. A cruiser has a fully loaded sailboat with solar panels, a bimini, and is stocked up with food and other personal items, and is looking for some type of comfort during sailing and prefers to get their boat broken as little as possible. And this is a really important distinction to make, because when you're new to sailing, you try to learn as much as you can, but it is very important to make a clear distinction between cruising and racing as to where you get your information from, as otherwise there's just too much information to try to learn before setting up. A group of experienced race sailors might get 7 knots of speed out of your boat, and at this moment you might only get 5 knots out of it. Well, who cares? You learn it along the way. And if you want to get fast from A to B, you probably shouldn't be on a boat anyway. You probably should take a plane. Besides the inter-island route, there's also a wind-wise and easier route called the I-65, which in about 10 to 12 days goes straight to the USVI, BVI or St. Martin. We're also going to talk about that option. One option Bruce suggests is, if you haven't cruised in foreign territories yet, is to start by doing a full season in the Bahamas. I totally agree with that. I spent 2 months in the Bahamas and I could have spent a lot more time there. But because time was running out to get before hurricane season started to the East Caribbean, I had to move on. After doing a season in the Bahamas, you also learn better about what else you need to change on your boat for longer distance trips. If you also want to read the other parts of the book that I don't talk about, there's a link to the book in the description of this video. I also want to note that this is not a 100% summary of this book. This is my summary of what I think you should know. We're going to start the sailing trip, as I don't want to talk about theory all the time. I want to make you excited for doing this trip, and during the trip we're also going to talk about a whole bunch of theory from the book. I originally arrived in the Abacos in the Bahamas after coming from Jamaica, so I had already checked in at Crate and Agra. However, for everyone who starts here in the Abacos, the first check-in point will be Spanish Key at waypoint 16. However, since there is an additional charge of $50 there, many prefer to check in at Green Turtle Key at waypoint 31 on a route that I created for you. So that's where we'll start this trip. Do note that if you download this trip and if you are going to add waypoints yourself, that the waypoint numbers will change. A little later we will also go to anchorages of Manjack Key at waypoint 20, Spanish Key at waypoint 16, Allen's Pensacola Key at waypoint 11 and Foxtown at waypoint 7. This route goes to the exact places where I dropped anchor, and you can already stop at these places on their way to Green Turtle to rest for the night. But as we officially have to check into the country before going on land, we stop at Green Turtle Key at waypoint 31. The first time I got here, I anchored my boat in New Plymouth at waypoint 41. It's quite a big area to drop anchor. The holding was good, and it's only a short dinghy ride into White Sound, waypoint 31, to check into the country. The second option would be to anchor or take a dock into White Sound. If your draft is more than 5.5 to 6 feet, you might have to go at high tide. There is place for a few boats to anchor and there are mooring buoys. In this video I want to make the start of your trip as easy as possible, so I would recommend, just like I did, to anchor here in New Plymouth at waypoint 41. From here I went by dinghy into White Sound. Let me show you a bit of Green Turtle Key before we talk about the check-in. I went around with a golf cart. It's a lovely town to visit. And the best conch salad here is made by
Eddie, the world famous head in Green Turtle Key, Abaco, Bahamas. If you ever want fresh conch salad, good conch salad, you come to the world famous, the one and only Eddie Bodie, Green Turtle Key, Abaco, Bahamas. Thank you.
I love it. Thank you very much.
You got it.
Supermarkets in the Bahamas are quite expensive, so it's best to stock up before arriving. So how much were the groceries?
$419.
Jeez. And the beer was?
$58.
$58. $58 for 24 small cans. There are lovely bars and restaurants in Green Turtle Key. We're going to Pineapples, pretty famous bar here. This is paradise, guys. This is gorgeous.
Pretty busy today.
Yeah. We are going to the Green Turtle Yacht Club. It's full with dollar signs everywhere, dollar bills, sorry. I've never seen anything like this. Before being able to check in, you have to apply for a cruising permit and fill in some other forms on the Click to Clear website. For a 3-month permit with a pleasure vessel under 34 feet, it's $150, and for a pleasure vessel above 34 feet, it's $300. Some people find this expensive. I've always been a budget cruiser, and I personally disagree. I don't think it's expensive. The Bahamas are hundreds of islands. If you like day sails, which I do, in the Bahamas the distances are so short that you can have coffee in the morning and breakfast, and then you lift up anchor and at lunch, or at least before dinner, drop anchor at a new place. I've been to many cheaper or free countries, and many of them only had 4 or 5 anchorages to visit, and then I had to do another long passage to get to the next country. And on those longer passages I would sometimes need fuel, or something would break on my boat, and that also cost money. And because the Bahamas are so many islands, we're so close by to each other and really beautiful, I don't think cruising the Bahamas is expensive. But of course you should take your time staying there, and not just for a week. We take the dinghy to the Green Turtle Club, where an agent can help us check in. From Green Turtle Key I sailed to Red Key, also called Menjack Key, at waypoint 20, which is a real lovely, quiet Bahama island. I took a walk on the beach. I sat in the water under an umbrella drinking rum and looking at a view of the beautiful Bahamian blue water with my boat on the background. And I tried to open a coconut. I continued sailing downwind to see Spanish Key at waypoint 16. When I started sailing my boat, I immediately started mostly solo and on open ocean, and because of the rougher conditions on open ocean, I often was too scared to try out new sail setups and actually learn better how to sail. I learned most of my sailing inside the Bahama banks because it's so protected. It's really nice and easy to sail inside the banks. When I arrived at Spanish Key, I snorkeled to a plane wreck there. There it is! In the book, Bruce talks about the use of waterproof paper charts. I and many of my friends don't use paper charts. I'm sure they might be good to have though, but most of us have Navionics or another navigation software on our phone or iPad and on 2 or 3 backup devices. Especially for traveling through these islands where the distances are pretty short, that has been enough for me. I'd love to make a full video on paper chart work one day. But as most of you guys starting out like me will never use a paper chart on this route, we're going to leave that out of the video. In my 3 years of sailing, the only paper charts I've ever seen and had to use was during my yachtmaster training and exam. One other difference between when this book was written and today is that digital charts on chart plotters and GPS have become a lot more accurate. In the book he says, when you get within 2 nautical miles of land, throw the chart plotter away. In 95% of my trips, the chart plotter has been perfectly accurate close to land. And over time, it only gets better. But for those 5% and for all other circumstances, like fishing pods, fishing boats, other boats going towards you, buoys that broke loose, etc., you obviously got to pay extra attention when you're close to land. Before I enter a new place, I always click on the anchorage area in Navionics and I read reviews. And often I also read reviews on Navily or No Foreign Land to see if other people wrote something about that anything wasn't correct on the charts or any other information I might want to know. That has been good enough for me. Occasionally, if I go to an area where less people have gone to, I download offline maps before entering a new place, which also gives a pretty good view of where the deep and shallow spots are. Actually, to be honest, the only place I used this was in the islands of Honduras. They were less traveled, and as apps like Navionics are partly so good because users can update changes to this area. This information was lacking at the time in certain areas of the islands of Honduras. The Caribbean route we are going to do is so well traveled that you have little need to use offline maps, but it's good to know it can help in case you need it one day. I continued from Spanish Key to Allen's Pensacola Key at waypoint 11. Dolphins! Arrived. There's a little trail all the way over there which goes to from one side of the beach to the other side. Let's check it out. Cruisers from all over the world have hung something on a tree and written their name on it. From Allen's Pensacola Key, I continue to Foxtown at waypoint 7. The town is over there. Let's check it out. Just parked the dinghy. The boat is, well, it's over there, really small, left to that little island. And yeah, the town is known as really authentic, not being affected by tourism. There's also nobody here. It's really quiet. From here I sailed back to Green Turtle Key to the New Plymouth anchorage at waypoint 41, as it was time to get water and do laundry. Close to the Green Turtle Club there are laundry machines where you pay $5 for a wash or dry load. Places like this are pretty common at bigger Bahamian islands. Although at some islands you cannot do your laundry yourself and you have to pay for a full service. I continued by dinghy to the government dock. Here is a water filtration plant where for free you can fill up your water jerry jugs. After Hurricane Dorian, Water Mission has set a filtration plant here because fresh drinking water was a problem, and it's been there ever since. There's nothing better than nice, clean, fresh drinking water. Also, this is pretty common at the bigger Bahamian islands. As for internet, in the Bahamas I had an unlimited internet plan with Alive for about 100 to 140 US$ per month, and surprisingly it worked almost everywhere in the Bahamian islands, even at most places that I felt like were in the middle of nowhere. You might be able to do with a cheaper contract, but as a YouTuber I need the internet to upload videos. They sometimes sell these SIM cards at Green Turtle Key, but if not, you might have to wait until you get to Marsh Harbour. Our next stop is going to be Marsh Harbour. On our way to Marsh Harbour we have to go out of the bank and back in again from waypoint 46 onwards, as it's too shallow to continue here on the bank. We are going out at Wilkie Cut, and here you should read the small letters written on the Navionics app. Here I'm using Navionics. It says, Wilkie Cut can be extremely dangerous when large swells from winter cold fronts or summer tropical storms are running. During moderate swells, make sure you cross on the 100-meter wide bar at its deepest point. Listen on VHF channel 68 to the 8:15 AM cruises net for whale cut conditions reports before setting up. So that is important to do. I remember when I got there, I saw a couple boats ahead of me on my AIS system going through, and I called them on the VHF and asked them what the conditions were. Besides talking about Bahamian internet, we haven't talked about communication methods yet. Of course, every boat will have a fixed VHF and a handheld VHF. To be really honest, in my first 6 months of sailing, my fixed VHF was broken and I only had a handheld VHF, but as the reach of a handheld VHF is a lot less than a fixed VHF, I cannot recommend that. Each boat should have both. In the book, Bruce talks about different forms of communication like an SSB radio and a ham radio. I would personally say it is generally best to have some internet communication available at all times when you start out. I didn't have this in the beginning, so when I crossed from Honduras to Cuba and a north front came over me, I didn't know what to do, and I also couldn't ask anyone. Not very convenient. Some of you will have Starlink. If you don't, there are two most used options for satellite internet to be able to send an emergency message when not in reach of normal internet. The Garmin InReach or InReach Mini. Both these devices allow you to send text messages, and besides that, the Iridium Go. With Iridium Go you can also receive grip files for your weather apps. Iridium Go is a little more expensive, but it has more options. Eventually everything will move to services like Starlink. If you decide not to use Starlink, I would say for the Caribbean you can pretty good get away with having a cheap Garmin InReach Mini, at least to be able to send messages when you're in trouble. As you're not doing very long offshore crossings and as you'll be sailing outside of hurricane season, I don't think you necessarily for the inter-island route need to be able to receive grip files for weather updates. Besides having a Garmin InReach Mini, I personally have bought SIM cards in each country which give you connection while you're sailing around the country itself, pretty much everywhere. And some of you might have a phone contract from your country that allows you to have internet in all these islands. In the nearby future I will probably add Starlink. Since we are talking about communication devices, I have an AIS transceiver, a Vesper XB8000. A transceiver can receive and send VHF signals, and besides that I can see other boats on my screen who have an AIS transceiver. Those other boats can see me too. And in my personal opinion, every beginner who is planning to do an overnight sail should have one. It's safer because you can see most of the other boats and they can see you too. I personally don't have a radar. If you can afford one and have the electric capacity to use it at night, it is obviously nice to have. Besides the VHF, which you frequently use, from all the other available devices, the only device I ever used was an SSB radio on the Pacific crossing. For the Caribbean, I don't see why you would need any other devices than we just talked about. I arrived at Marsh Harbour at waypoint 58. It is the first place we get to that has quite a big supermarket, probably with the best prices in the Abacos.
Supermarket is really, really big. I expected it to be, I heard stories that it was quite a bit cheaper here, but not really.
And also a marine store, which is quite big for a Bahamian marine store. Although compared to a West Marine, they have very little. I continued to get ready to leave the Abacos on the way to Eleuthera. But first I made a stop at Cormorant Key. On my way to Cormorant Key, after passing Pepper Key, between waypoints 70 and 71, I had to stay on the purple dotted line to stay in the deeper water. My route is going exactly over that. I arrived at Cormorant Key at waypoint 74. Cormorant Key has a space for a few boats. I was the only boat there at the time. It's nice, I like to alternate being in towns around people and supplies and being in the middle of nowhere all by myself. About half a mile south of the Snaky Cut Inlet, I entered with my dinghy to a gorgeous dinghy ride over a shallow bank. I did hit bottom here with my dinghy engine, so be careful, it's shallow.
Good morning. Oops, I touched the bottom. I think everything is okay. Let's continue. So a little shallow, this part. It's beautiful here though.
I made one more stop at the end of the Abacos at Linyard Key to be close to the exit of the Abacos Bank, to be ready to do the plus minus 55-mile trip to Spanish Wells in the Eleuthera Bank on a day sail. On the way to Linyard Key there is a shallow area between waypoints 78 and 79 where you have to be careful to stay in between the buoys, but it is marked well. I arrived at Linyard Key at waypoint 84. On avionics you see a red block with a white stripe. That means that it's a recommended spot for snorkeling there. Besides having had to pay attention when exiting Wilkie Cut, I experienced this as a real lovely sailing inside the bank. Now we're going to cross 55 miles over open ocean and we're going to discuss a whole bunch of theory from the book First about strategies for sailing the Caribbean. Actually that's not correct, it is the strategies for sailing to windwards, towards the wind in the Caribbean. Because that is basically what we will be struggling with up until we reach St. Martin. From there we can plan our routes in a way that we have mostly beam reach sails. The general rule in cruising over open ocean with a sailboat is to avoid upwind sailing as much as possible, especially when it involves sailing against moderate or higher waves. If you've seen my video about how to sail the East Caribbean, in that video I spent about an hour explaining how to look at the different weather apps in order to find a comfortable weather window sailing the East Caribbean. That video will give you a good understanding of how to use and read weather apps. Those sails are mostly based around the general rule in sailing, which is to avoid upwind sailing as much as possible, which you absolutely can in the East Caribbean. However, as Bruce also says in this book, for the trip from the East USA towards the East Caribbean until you reach St. Martin, forget about it. You will generally always be upwind sailing. It's just how it's going to be. That's why in this video we focus on strategies to sail against the wind and still be comfortable to get you to the East Caribbean. Understanding Caribbean weather. Before being able to make a decision about when to sail and when not to sail going from west to east, we first have to understand a couple basics about how weather in the Caribbean works. In this video we talk about the trip from the West Bahamas to the start of the East Caribbean, the USVI, United States Virgin Islands, BVI, the British Virgin Islands, or St. Martin. The mainstream of the trade winds rarely get above 22 degrees or below 10 degrees latitudes on this part of the world. Under 22 degrees the prevailing wind is east-southeast. Between 22 degrees and 23.5 degrees it wiggles a little in direction. 23.5 degrees is called the Tropics of Cancer. Above 23.5 degrees it is said to be northeast to southeast. More importantly, above 23.5 degrees as we're getting away from the mainstream trade winds, the wind and sea state tends to get lighter. An alternative route to this inter-island route that we are mostly talking about in this video is the I-65, which basically means you sail from the Bahamas or the USA towards the longitude 65 degrees west line or even further, staying around or north of the 25 degrees north line to stay away from the mainstream trade winds, which often give heavier wind and seas around and under the 22 degrees north line. This is a route that takes about 8 to 12 days. The idea of this route is that you can do it on 2 tacks, one to the northeast and one south to the USVI, BVI or St. Martin. On the tack south you will go through the stronger trade winds, but as you should be somewhat on a beam reach, wind to the side of the boat, it should also be a lot more comfortable. Of course you will not always be able to do it on 2 tacks, but it will be a whole lot less tacking as on the inter-island route. The advantages of this route is that it's faster as you're doing it in one go. It's hopefully on 2 tacks and the sea state should be milder. The disadvantage is that it's a longer offshore trip. But on the inter-island trip you will be able to see all those islands, you're closer to land if anything happens, and the trips are obviously a lot shorter. But the downside of that trip is that you have to wait longer every time to get a decent weather window, and that the wind and sea state generally is less mild. In this video we are mostly talking about how to get without too much hassle through the inter-island trip, and are going to discuss all the features that change the prevailing wind in our advantage. Let's say that there would not have been any islands in the Caribbean. Now we can say that if there is no tropical wave, cold or warm front, the wind in the cruising season in the non-hurricane months from December to June, which is in the Caribbean winter, will most of our trip be from the east-southeast with 15 to 25 knots. However, there are islands and sometimes there are tropical waves or there is a cold or warm front. And luckily for us, because we want to go against the trade winds to get to the East Caribbean, and those islands and weather conditions are helping us to get to our destination easier. So now we know that our general expectation is to see wind from the east-southeast of 15 to 25 knots, unless there are tropical waves or there is a cold or warm front or an island effect that can help us. Now let's first talk about optimal weather conditions to sail east, and then talk about all those different features that can help us to get east. Choosing the optimal departure weather. Learn how to choose suitable weather conditions for departure on windward journeys. Before diving into this rule, there's one statement that Bruce keeps making over and over and over and over in his book, and that is wait for weather. Always and always wait for weather if you want to be comfortable. Let's continue with choosing the optimal departure weather. In the book he advises you to learn to look at weather in Force Beaufort. Here you see the Force Beaufort scale. It was originally invented by hydrographer Francis Beaufort, and it is a measure that relates wind speed to observed conditions at land or sea. The reason he says learn to look at weather in Force Beaufort is because if he advises you to, for an example, only leave in Force 4, Force 4 says it is 11 to 16 knots of wind, a moderate breeze with fairly frequent white horses, which is that white foam that you see on top of a wave, and 4 to 5 feet waves. So now on a late morning where the weather prediction is 13 knots of wind, however the 2 days before, up until early this morning, there were 25 knots of wind, we can be sure that the waves late this morning are quite more substantial than 4 to 5 feet still, and thus it is currently not Force Beaufort 4, and this is not a good time to leave. We will have to wait more time until the waves settle to Force Beaufort 4 height of waves. And if there is no time enough today for this to happen because later today the wind is picking up again, then today is not a good weather window to go. Same counts for if he advises to go maximum at Force Beaufort 3, a 7 to 10 knot gentle breeze where the crests begin to break, meaning where the top of the wave just starts to break, with waves of 2 to 3 feet, and the weather forecast is indeed 8 knots, but heavy weather that happened further away brings in swell that gives us 4 or 5 plus knot waves. Then again, it is not Force Beaufort 3 and thus not an advisable day to go. One thing to remember is that, as he says himself in the book, that he wrote it less for the person who has an Amel Super Maramu, which at the time was more the exception than the rule, but for the person who has a small to medium-sized boat. The smaller the boat is, the more important it is to stick to these rules to be comfortable. A bigger boat will give you a bit more comfort, and after knowing and understanding the conditions to be comfortable going east, you can decide yourself how many % you and your boat can divert from this to still be comfortable. Here's a picture that explains which force Beaufort will still give you a comfortable ride going to windward towards the wind in the Caribbean. When you are leaving on your trip and the wind prediction for the direction you are going is between 0 to 2 force Beaufort straight on the nose. When the wind is on the nose on less than 30% like this, we have decided to motor or motor sail, as we cannot sail on this angle. When I say motor sail, I'm talking about motoring while you only have the mainsail up. The mainsail can be used a lot closer to the wind than the headsail, and motoring with the mainsail up will give some extra speed and help with keeping the boat steady and not rocking from left to right, which sometimes is the case when you just motor without any sails up. So this means that if the wind is between 0 and 6 knots up until a light breeze with maximum small waves, and where the top of the waves still look glassy like a mirror, with waves up until 1 foot. This is the maximum forecast he suggests to still be a gentleman while motoring or motor sailing to windward. When you are leaving on your trip and you decide to take the wind angle from 30 to 60 degrees towards the boat. This is a motor sail to very maybe a sail. A lot of people will tell you, my boat can sail 30 degrees off the wind. There's a problem with this while we sail from west to east. Let me quote a story from the book. Jalan, which is the name of Bruce's sailboat, persisted in giving me a fat 50 degrees on the passages described in this guide. I guess a 35-foot sloop with a 30 horsepower auxiliary and a retired couple aboard should do about the same. With 50 degrees tacks at 5 knots, you shall put 14.4 miles under the keel for each 10 miles on a windward rumline. With minimum of half knot equatorial current against you, make it 16.6 miles. To make 5 knots, you've got to have a Beaufort force 4 to 5 with seas 4 to 7 feet. You will lose way with those seas. You shall lose about 1 degree of course for each Beaufort number. So a cruising boat should get 1.75 keel miles to each rumpline mile while tacking, which basically means that tacking back and forth against the wind will take at least 75% longer than sailing in a straight line. Here you see a part of a route that a friend of mine did on his Pearson 424, a 42-foot boat. There's a link to his full route in the description of this video. He describes it like this. Cruising boats generally can sail 45 to 50 degrees off the wind on heading, but with the wave, wind and current against your COG. For who doesn't know what COG is, it's the course over the ground, which is the actual GPS path or route you are making after the effects of the waves, the wind and the current. After all these effects, it will often be 60 to 65 degrees. And if you're trying to sail 100 nautical miles directly to windward on a 60 degrees angle, you will actually sail 200 nautical miles and your one-day trip will become 2 days like this. The point of these two examples is to give you an impression of the extra time needed to do some of these trips. Thus, when we say force Beaufort 3 is acceptable, if we have the wind coming between 30 and 60 degrees towards the boat, this means we are either motor sailing or we are sailing depending on our boat and how far the wind is towards 30 degrees or towards 60 degrees. The maximum to still be a gentleman and going to windward here is up until 10 knots of wind where the crests begin to break, meaning where the top of the wave just starts to break with waves of 2 to 3 feet. The next is force Beaufort 4 between 60 and 90 degrees towards the boat. An upwind sail where we have maximum about 15 knots of wind towards the boat and a moderate breeze with fairly frequent white horses. Fairly frequent means on about 30% of the top of the surrounding waves, and white horses means that white foam that you see on top of a wave. And 4 to 5 feet waves maximum to still be a gentleman and sail towards the wind. You understand the concept of this picture now, and I don't think there's any point of explaining force Beaufort 5 or 6 from behind the beam. You're going to rarely have it on this trip, and if you do, you understand now that this is the maximum. Again, you should see this picture as the maximum wind and wave forecast to go east in the Caribbean and still be a gentleman. This is what you are waiting for as a weather window before setting off. One other easy thing to remember is that when going east in all the suggestions he makes in the whole book, the absolute maximum predicted wind to take is 15 knots. So going out in an east direction in a predicted wind more than 15 knots coming towards any upwind angle to the boat is always wrong. On our trip, the prevailing wind is between 15 and 25 knots, mostly from the east-southeast up until from the northeast, depending on where we are. Wind blowing any direction not within those limits has changed from island effects or from substantial weather features in its way, such as a tropical wave or the rare cold or warm front. Now the big question, how will this help us? The four main features that help us going from west to east on this trip are 1. Sailing inside banks on the leeward side of the island, 2. Islands and banks that give off heat at night, 3. Tropical waves, 4. Cold and warm fronts, and 5. Sea and land breezes. Number 1. Sailing inside banks on the leeward side of the island. On our trip we are sailing through the Abacos bank, then through the Eleuthera bank, then through the Exuma bank, and finally through the Long Island bank. How does a wave actually work? When wind has been blowing for a certain amount of time in one direction, wind creates friction over the surface. The surface of the ocean is the top layer of the ocean, and that friction created by wind creates waves. By sailing inside these banks on the leeward side of the banks, the leeward side is the wind protected side, the windward side is the other side where the wind is blowing towards the land. What happens is that the waves that have been building up over a long distance are being stopped by the land. The wind does not have enough time to build up those waves on the leeward side as we are sailing pretty close to the land, and thus we will have a lot smaller waves and thus a lot more comfortable sails and can go out in heavier forecast than we would have when we would have sailed in open ocean. Number 2, islands and banks that give off heat at night. On this trip, sailors benefit most from the reduction of wind and waves in the lee of an island, meaning the wind and wave protected area of an island. On this trip we don't sail a lot on leeward sides of islands, but in the Bahamas we do. The Bahamas Islands are small and not very mountainous. They will block the waves when you're close to land, but they don't have the capability to block the wind a lot during the day. However, these banks, when there is decent sun during the day, at night they will give up all that heat while they cool down. Because of that, at night they create something called a thermal. A thermal creates a barrier to the lower level of the prevailing winds. Because of this, when we are doing a night passage on the leeward side of a Bahama bank or the Turks and Caicos bank, we're going to have a much calmer ride as during the day. Because most of us are beginners and mostly are not comfortable yet doing continuous night passages for a more comfortable ride, or just prefer to do mostly day sailing, I am focusing as much as I can in this video on day sailing, as out of my experience this is what the majority of people prefer to do. Number 3, a tropical wave. Basically how it works is like this. A storm usually starts as a tropical wave, then turns into a tropical depression, which then can turn into a tropical storm and finally into a hurricane. In the cruising season it is unlikely to have a hurricane, but we can have a tropical wave, tropical depression, or a light tropical storm. Here you see an example of a tropical storm. They generally move from east to west and then go north. They change the prevailing east wind for a certain amount of time. How much and for how long they will change it, you can see on either predict wind or the windy app. The first question is if one of these weather features actually comes straight over us, or maybe it is passing north or south of us. If it's coming straight over us, we could potentially sail a bit before it comes over us, if we are sure that we have enough time to make it to a safe haven before it comes over us. Or we wait until the worst of it has passed and then we are riding the end of it, until the weather returns back to normal. If the worst part of the weather system passes north or south of us, we can sail the whole duration that the weather system changes the wind in our favor. Number 4, cold and warm fronts. A cold front is when cold air moves a lot faster than warm air and it overtakes the warm air. Here you see an example of a cold front. You see the screen here from the app Predict Wind turn red, and the wind is changing direction from an east direction to north wind. Cold air from the north is overtaking warmer air in the south, and the wind temporarily turns to come from the north. You don't want to be sailing when this comes over. I was sailing once when it came over, and it creates very confusing seas and a lot of wind for a couple hours. But you can sail on the tail of these fronts, meaning when they just came over and start to lose their strength, they will still cause a continuation of a different wind angle than the prevailing east wind for a certain amount of time. And we can sail on the tail of them until the prevailing east wind returns. As Bruce says, if you want to only go in sunny weather, take a plane. Clear weather in the winter usually means 20 knots on the nose and hobby horsing into 6 to 8 foot short seas. By including fronts in your winter strategy, you can cut weeks of your trip south and at the same time ensure yourself of a good 3 days to a week of leisure fishing while doing a wait for weather. We'll talk about number 5, sea and land breezes, later, because the land in the Bahamas is not big enough to create them. So now you have a whole bunch of tools to choose a decent weather window in the week you want to go to safely and comfortably do the next trip. I left Linyard Key just before sunrise because to do a 55-mile trip on my 30-foot boat while leaving and arriving in daylight, I have to make some decent speed of 5 knots average and without tacking, otherwise I wouldn't make it. Besides that, from when I arrived at waypoint 89, I had to navigate through reefs and shallow areas, which is really not so hard if you stay on these navigation lines, but I did need to make sure that I arrived with sufficient daylight to do the last part of the trip, about 3.5 miles, until reaching to my anchorage at waypoint 101. We are now inside the Eleuthera bank. Let's go explore beautiful Spanish wells. From Spanish Wells, I continued about 20 miles to Glass Window Bridge. In the middle, we need to go through Current Cut Inlet between waypoint 107 and 110. And we need to make sure that we either go through 1 hour before or after high or low tides, or on an outgoing tide, because there can be up to 6 to 8 knots of current, and if the current is against us, my 20 horsepower engine for sure cannot push against that. The time of high and low tide here is a little unclear. Some write it's 1.5 hours after high tide in Nassau, some say 2.5 hours after. As I have a small boat with a small engine, I dropped anchor before the cut and waited until a bigger boat went through, and then on the radio asked what the current was they experienced. The first catamaran that went through experienced 4 knots of current against them. When an hour and a half later a bigger monohull went through, who experienced little current against them, I decided to follow. I'll talk about current more when we are in the Exumas. I dropped anchor at waypoint 114, Glass Window Bridge.
That's where we're gonna go.
From Glass Window Bridge I continue to Hatchet Bay. Hatchet Bay, which has the entrance at waypoint 118, is a hurricane hole. The majority of people doing this trip will around July-ish be around Grenada. A few people make the choice to spend the hurricane season from June to December in Luperon in the Dominican Republic. The general rule for a hurricane is that you run away from it unless you can't, then you find shelter. A hurricane hole basically is an anchorage with a narrow entrance which keeps out the swell of the ocean in bad weather. The entrance should be deep enough so that you can enter at any time of the day at any tide. Preferably to put the boat in a place with only a few feet under the keel. Storm surge will raise the boat, not lower it. Of course, preferably with good holding, and you need to be able to put lines from the boat to shore or be able to tie the boat to the mangroves. Putting the boat into the mangroves is always advised as best option, as it is the softest wall to protect the boat from damage. The problem with the traditional hurricane holes in the Caribbean is that once there is a real threat of a hurricane, these places tend to immediately get extremely crowded with local boats and boats of travelers. All the traditional hurricane holes like Hurricane Hole St. John, Ensenada, Honda, Culebra, Puerto Rico, Gorda Sound, Virgin Gorda, Virgin Islands, and Simpson Bay, St. Martin, all of them have been hit once in the last 100 years or so by a hurricane, which destroyed or badly damaged most of the boats. When getting crowded, if your neighbor doesn't tie his boat as well as you do, his boat might damage yours. Luperon in the Dominican Republic has not yet had a direct hit that was recorded. However, the point is, there is no guaranteed safe hurricane hole. I would say as a beginner, you should go for the safest option possible and plan around June to be under about St. Vincent. With a secondary option, if you can't make it, to consider Luperon in the Dominican Republic. I personally did not want to go to a hurricane hole because it means you stop sailing, and on or about St. Vincent you can keep sailing during hurricane season. After entering through the narrow pass, I dropped anchor at waypoint 120. Let's go explore Hatchet Bay.
Welcome to Hatchet Bay.
Hitchhiking is really easy in the Bahamas, and with some new made friends from another boat, we hitchhiked to Governor's Harbour. They told me that hitchhiking is very easy in the Bahamas, and it is, because almost every car will stop.
Thank you very much.
From Hatchet Bay, I continued to Nassau, where I dropped anchor at waypoint 128. Nassau has the biggest marine stores of the Bahamas. It's the best place in the Bahamas if you need any supplies. It's the biggest tourist destination of the Bahamas, and if you're into renting an ATV or jet ski, do parasailing or sit on a banana behind a boat, Nassau is the place to be. Most cruisers I know do not spend a very long time in Nassau. I went here because I needed to get some supplies to fix my boat. From Nassau I sailed over the bank to Highbourne Key North at waypoint 135, which is part of the Exumas bank. From here I took the dinghy to Allen's Key South. It's also called the Iguana Beach.
This place here is famous for Iguana Beach. This is Iguana Beach where I'm now, and there are a lot of iguanas. Here's one. Hello little fella. Hey. They are everywhere. There is another one. Oh, he's walking away from me. Hello.
I left Harbour Key going around the shallow area all the way about 35 miles to Foul Key at waypoint 156. It's an anchorage which has space for a couple boats. From here I took the dinghy to the aquarium just behind Bell Island. When you zoom out on avionics, you see a red dotted line. This means that it's part of a national park. You have to pay about $10 per night to be anchored there. So I anchored just outside of it and went to see the aquarium by dinghy. Close by to the anchorage of Foul Key are also caves that I visited. After Foul Key, I continued inside the Exuma bank to Staniel Cay at waypoint 165. Close by that anchorage is another key that's also called Foul Key, a little confusing. This is the anchorage where I'm gonna anchor. There are three famous things to do here. The first is taking the dinghy over to the Pig Beach. There's another one. The second is snorkeling the Thunderball Grotto, a cave once used in a James Bond movie. Alright, we arrived. This is the Thunderbolt Grotto. James Bond movie was recorded here a long time ago.
Careful where you come up there.
Yeah, it's And the third is going to the Staniel Cay Yacht Club and see all the nurse sharks. If you've seen my video, New Sailboat Owners First Year Full-Time Sailing the Caribbean, you know that I've had some issues with dragging because my anchor was too light. My new anchor was sent to the Staniel Cay Yacht Club by the company Makers Air. There are several companies like this and they fly to a variety of islands in the Bahamas. I picked up my new anchor at the Staniel Cay Yacht Club, so if something breaks on your boat which you can't get in the Bahamas, this is a pretty easy way to send it from the States. From here we're going out of Staniel Cay. As we're going from the shallow bank to the deeper open ocean, I want to show you a video clip of a previous video where I talked about entering and exiting in and out of banks. There are two sides of the Exumas. The one with the very deep water and on the other side the bank with very shallow water. I did not know anything about tides. When I tried to go from the deep side through an entrance to the Exuma bank, I couldn't make it.
The Exumas is famous for this problem. This is called the Exumas in the Bahamas, and this is because, well, behind me you see land, and the cuts where you have to go through with the boat are really narrow. So high tide, low tide, here it happens every 6 hours, and the water flow is slowest close to high tide or close to low tide. So let's say that high tide is at 12 and low tide at 6 p.m. So then it's like an hour before 12, so 11, between 11 and 1 it's calmest, and between 5 and 7, but in between, like between 3 and 4 is like its height. And that was when I was trying to go through, which was quite dangerous. And yeah, because it's such a narrow pass, when it's at its height, it's just, you know, all that water is starting to force itself through that little narrow path. Yeah, so now I'm going really slow, and yeah, in half an hour it is close to low tide, and then I will go through. I learned something today. I learned it the hard way, but at least now I know. So here in avionics, I can go to weather and tides, and then I'm just gonna go to tides, and then I'll choose the one that's closest by, and then I can see that now here I'm almost at low tide. It's 3 p.m. and it's now 2:15, so I should be good. The day I did this exit, it went really smooth. You can see the beginning of the conflicting currents. It's going to get worse and worse in the next hours. However, here you see another time when I exited a cut, not at slack tide. Come on, just a little bit more, then we're out of this. Come on. It wasn't horrible, but I also wouldn't call it comfortable. Plus, you better have a reliable engine, because if the engine stops while you're trying to go through, while the current is pushing you backwards, it can make a pretty dangerous situation. It's about 60 miles to Georgetown. Halfway I made a stop at Ruddercut Key. When I entered Ruddercut Key, I had to make sure that I entered also an hour before low tide, or after low tide when the tide is coming in and it would push me in. Going into this cut between an hour after high tide and an hour before low tide, when the tide is going out and is going against us, is not a wise decision. I arrived at waypoint 181 at Ruddercut Key. Just arrived, let's check this place out. It is a beautiful sunrise and we are on the way again. When I continued to Georgetown and had to exit Ruddercut Key, it's of course the opposite of when I entered. The time to absolutely avoid exiting is now at an incoming tide between 1 hour after low tide to 1 hour before high tide. So the general rule at any cut is to go at any time between an hour before or an hour after high or low tide, and of course when the tide is in our favor and pushes us in the direction we want to go. But if you don't know when that is, just stick to between 1 hour before or 1 hour after low or high tide. I continued to Georgetown. In Georgetown I stayed at waypoint 193 and later 2 at 196. Georgetown is one of the most famous places to go for cruisers in the Bahamas. In Georgetown at the dinghy dock you can fill up your jerry cans for free, and on walking distance there are laundry services. Got some nice colorful houses here. The reflection of the sun in the Bahamas is so sharp. I have to pinch my eyes. I should probably get sunglasses. This is honestly the best view I have ever had from a restaurant. Isn't this amazing? Quite a lot of really nice walking trails here. After Georgetown, I continued to Thompson Bay, Long Island, waypoint 213. So this is Thompson Bay. There are actually quite a lot of boats over there, and here is where the cruisers get together. I want to fly the drone here, but sadly it broke yesterday. We'll have to find a fix for that. I want to show you a video clip of some people who I met there. Okay, where are you guys from?
Norway.
And you are from?
I'm from Norway as well.
I'm from Denmark, so I'm the minority on the boat.
And you own the boat. How old are you guys?
We're 20 and 21 and 22.
Nice. And so why are you here? How did this happen? How did?
It's actually a really funny story.
So I set off from Norway. This was originally my friend's dream, and he didn't manage to get it going. So I took it in my own hands.
You always wanted to sail around.
No, he always wanted to sail. I was like, yeah, we could do the Med probably, and then we went all the way. And then
nice.
I met Johanna from my high school. I met her in Amsterdam.
Oh, you're from his high school? That's so cool. So where did you start it, and what's your plan?
We started from Oslo, the capital of Norway, and we're gonna head back. That's our plan.
Nice.
Yeah.
I've been on the boat for a month and a half now.
How is it?
It's really nice. I'm very pleasantly surprised. I didn't know how it was going to be before I came.
You want to stay sailing?
I would love to, but I have a plane ticket home in 2 weeks actually. Yeah.
And you? Are you going to stay on the boat?
I'm staying until Oslo. Or
Okay.
to Denmark actually.
Yeah.
Or Oslo, we'll see.
And then
But
back
yeah, I really like it as well.
Nice. And what is this boat? What are you sailing?
We are sailing a Finnish-made boat. It's a King's Cruiser made by Fiskars.
33 feet.
33 feet, yeah.
And how does it all work together with 3 on a 33 feet boat?
Good.
It's fine. It's
With some noise cancelling, it works well.
Yeah, yeah.
So 5 hours later, still on the same boat. What's going on here? It's
We're making some guacamole.
guacamole, and well, what are you guys drinking? Fireball.
Fireball.
Gordon's, of course.
Well, that's
Cheapest rum.
cheapest
Out
rum.
of Puerto Rico.
Well, you guys are living the life. Nice.
We are.
I wanted to show this inspirational video clip of a group of early 20 youngsters so you realize that if they can do it, that you can do it too. I continued from Thompson Bay to Calabash Bay at waypoint 227.
It's a resort, and that's also the only thing that's here.
After Calabash Bay, it was already starting to get later in the season, and I decided to make way towards the Dominican Republic. On the next trips, there was not a lot of protection from the wind and waves, and to still make it before sunset to the next anchorage, as I tried to make some stops on the way, I have motor sailed quite a bit. I would like to talk about engine capacity and reliability. What to expect when you don't really know too much about this before setting off, like I did myself. One thing that has changed in the last 50 years or so is that the general size of boats we use are a lot bigger. Many newer sailboats are actually half motorboats. What I mean is, where back in the days, sailboats had engines strong enough to get you in and out of the marina, like the boat I did the trip on. Newer boats, besides are designed to go faster, have engines that have the capability to get you a lot faster and a lot more comfortable from A to B than many older boats, and certainly the older small boats. And having this extra power gives us the opportunity, if we can't find the weather to sail, to motor sail, or to wait for a calm weather window and motor. The first secret that I'm going to tell you that most sailors do not want to admit, unless you know them really well, but that the author of this book also clearly states, is that you are using the engine quite a lot going from west to east. Whether motoring or motor sailing, we all don't want to admit it because, you have a sailboat, you don't want to admit you motor a lot. But the reality is, if you're going through these islands, often going straight against the wind, and you don't have unlimited time and unlimited patience, like most people don't, well, then you gotta make a choice. The unexperienced sailor, like I was, often relies on the engine to get in and out of the harbor and out of trouble situations. And on this trip, we'll most likely use it quite a bit more than in the past to push us to windward on days that we need it. A friend of mine has a 50-foot Beneteau with a 110 horsepower engine, and another friend of mine has an ML Super Merimu, which is a 53-foot boat with a 100 horsepower engine. I have a 30-foot boat with a 20 horsepower engine. To give you an idea of what the difference is, if I went out on a day when the weather turned out rougher as expected, and I decided that motor sailing is the best way forward to my next destination, let's say I'm having 20 knots of wind on the nose, straight towards me, and the waves are above 1.6 or 1.7 meters or above 5 feet, where my two friends will be a little uncomfortable motoring between 6 and 7 knots. With my 30-foot boat and 20 horsepower engine, instead of a little uncomfortable, I'm pretty miserable and expect to do about 2 knots. Compare it to taking a Chevrolet Spark or a Ford Fiesta through the desert compared to taking a Dakar truck through the desert. If the sand is not too loose, both vehicles can do it. However, obviously the Dakar truck will have quite a bit an easier time. There are 3 main reasons about the difference in comfortability. The first is that the bigger the vessel, the more stable it lies on the ocean. The second is that the longer the vessel, the easier it will go over waves. Why? Because where a small boat might go over the first wave and then a second wave pushes the boat back, a boat with a longer waterline will go over the first wave and then fall on the second wave, and thus will not get pushed back by the second wave as much as a small boat with a short waterline. The third reason is the size engine, but of course, even if you would have my 30-foot boat with a 100 horsepower engine, it would still go over the first wave and get pushed back by the second. In my experience, on average, depending on the boat, starting at around 40 feet and up, the speed and comfortability starts to greatly improve. One of the differences between newer and older boats is that the waterline of newer boats is longer. For an example, an old 40-foot boat like an S&S from 1974 has a waterline of less than 29 feet, which is definitely on the small end for a comfortable waterline. While a new Beneteau Oceanus of 40 feet, for an example, has a waterline of 39.2 feet. A longer waterline generally means more speed. Of course, if you have a 30-foot boat like I do, your choices of when to go out to go to windward becomes even more important than when your boat is 40 foot plus. It has happened to me a couple times, especially when on Puerto Rico, where I went out on the wrong time of day and I was motor sailing for a few hours with less than 2 knots on average. I can promise you it's quite frustrating. I hope with the tools I give you in this video, I can prevent this from happening to you too much. About engine reliability. Most people underestimate the time that they will have to use the engine going from west to east. On this trip, most of us will get into a couple situations where we're going to seriously need the engine to help us for hours on end. And this is the moment where everything which was good enough to help you in a normal condition is going to break now. I had to ship engine parts to the Turks and Caicos, where I'll talk about soon. The issue with shipping parts is that, one, you need to be in a place that has a FedEx or similar that you can send parts to. Two, it costs time to send parts, so you will need to wait for it. And 3, you're paying shipping and import fees. Not everybody will agree with this statement I'm going to make, but for me personally, if I will make a boat ready that I plan to be my house for the next 10 years or more, and if the engine, which is the heart of the boat, is old, if I would have the money, I'd love to put a brand new one in, just to be sure I have a whole lot less worries for the next 10 years. The reason for this is that I'm trying to make my life more comfortable and safer every day. Of course, if your engine is less than 10 years old or hardly used, or if you are a very experienced die-hard pure sailor, it is not necessary. The latter can go without engine. But if you are a very experienced die-hard pure sailor, you're obviously not watching my video anyway. I continued sailing upwind on a day where the wind was predicted under 15 knots with 3 to 5 foot seas to Crockett Island, Pitstown anchorage.
This day really turned out to be a fantastic day for sailing. Calm seas, doing 4 or 5 knots. I am totally happy.
One of the reasons I stopped here was to buy some fuel. I only have a 17-gallon fuel tank and some jerry cans, and my plan was to go straight to the Dominican Republic after the Bahamas. So I decided to buy some more fuel here and make a stop for the night.
I just made a quick stop at Crockett Island to get some fuel. It's an interesting place. It's really quiet. This is some kind of hotel resort, well, behind this building. And then the very blue ocean. This is a landing strip, which seems to be for private planes, I think. I'm not sure. I parked my dinghy at the wrong spot where the marina wasn't, so now I'm getting the royal ride back with the jerry jugs to the dinghy.
When I continued from Crockett Island, I did not want to wait for a weather system that would make the wind direction more favorable for me to sail. The weather was light and I decided to continue motor sailing. As you know, I only have a 20 horsepower engine and a small boat, so I can only do that against light wind and wave conditions. I was considering making it a long run all the way to the Dominican Republic, but after about 20 miles the bracket of my alternator broke, and in the afternoon I decided to make a stop at Atwood Harbour in Acklins Islands, where I borrowed a drill from a neighbor boat to fix it as my drill was broken. Having a reliable autopilot and a spare autopilot unit is an absolute must for the 99% of the sailors who want to have some comfort. It is hard enough to go east. Without an autopilot, it just becomes a whole lot less comfortable. And unless you enjoy being miserable, I cannot advise going without one. One of the biggest challenges of staying positive while sailing east, especially when doing it solo or with other unexperienced people, is exhaustion. And the autopilot helps a great deal in preventing this. From here I continued north of Mayaguana. I could have made it in a day sail to Mayaguana and spent a night there, but as it already was in June, I had left too late on this trip because I had really enjoyed being in the Bahamas, so I decided to continue on an overnight sail. At the time I didn't really understood the effects of a sea or land breeze or a night lee very well, and I thought that if I would sail along the coast at night, I would have some protection. However, the Bahamian Islands are too small for a sea or land breeze. What a sea or land breeze exactly is, we're going to talk about soon, but we have talked about the night lee. In a wind under 15 knots, Mayaguana would have a night lee. However, if the wind blows from the east-southeast like it was, then there will only be a little night lee on the west side, where the heat above Mayaguana stops the east-southeast trade winds from blowing. However, I was sailing on the north side of Mayaguana, so there wasn't any weather feature really helping me. If I would have do it again under the same conditions, I would have probably stopped for the night in Mayaguana. After waypoint 252, where I arrived early in the morning, I went on quite an upwind beat south. Well, when I started this trip, I didn't really know much about weather prediction and many things from this book, like how to look at weather using Force Beaufort. I wasn't able to really understand this, and I also wasn't patient enough to wait and learn first before doing this trip. And because of that, countless times on this trip, I've gotten myself into situations where I shouldn't have been in. And with this video and the other recent long videos I've made, I hope to be able, within a couple hours, to have you have a much more comfortable ride than I did. I actually considered to keep going to the Dominican Republic, as I was a bit on a time constraint before any hurricane would potentially come. However, in the afternoon, when I got close to the Turks and Caicos bank, my fresh water pump from the engine broke and I wasn't able to fix it. So now I had two options that I was considering. One was to sail to the Dominican Republic, which was still in a southeast direction, or to stop at the Turks and Caicos, check in and order the parts. The fear that I had was that I already had done a sleepless night motor sailing north of Marijuana, and a part of the upcoming weather was predicted to be really light, which means that if I can't sail, I would have been drifting towards Haiti. And if there's one place you don't want to accidentally be drifting to in the Caribbean islands, it's Haiti. And the same could happen if something else would go wrong on this trip, like if my head sail would rip and I would need several hours to repair it. I used an electric water pump to circulate water through my engine, which allowed me to use the motor temporarily to get into the protected anchorage of West Caicos. There's a marina in development, but I asked nicely and I could go to shore and also fill up my water there.
Good morning. It's a very good protected anchorage here, that's nice. Currently my only form of communication is a satellite device where I can only send text messages with. A friend of mine in the States is helping me to get the part from the States to the Turks and Caicos. I'm waiting to go to the mainland until I know when it will arrive, because it costs $50 for a week to check in here, or $300 after a week if you want to stay longer. So I'm trying to keep it on that $50 for a week.
The reason a lot of people skip the Turks and Caicos, especially for longer than a week, is because many anchorages are quite rolly, not really well protected. And even though it's a different country than the Bahamas, the geography is similar. So for most sailors who just spent a couple months in the Bahamas, it's not worth paying the same money as in the Bahamas to be there for a while. I continued from West Caicos to Sapodilla Bay in Providenciales to do the check-in and go pick up my new fresh water pump. I need to do another 16 miles to get to the big island where there are amenities and where there is internet, and I added a water jug to the system, so now the pump sucks water from the water jug and then pushes it through the engine, and then it comes back into the water jug, and the extra amount of water in the water jug will hopefully decrease the temperature enough so that the water pump will not break. I connect the plus and minus on the battery, and there it goes. The Turks and Caicos is a big bank which in the night, as we know, gives up heat, and under 50 knots of wind it creates a shield against the trade winds and thus can make the water at night very calm. So the right strategy to do this 12 or so miles trip would be to go as early as possible, preferably even before sunrise, to arrive at the entrance of the Sandboard Channel in order to have as much time as possible to get close to the anchorage before the sun comes up and is letting the trades come through again. I had left in the morning, but definitely not early enough. And I had a hell of a ride tacking back and forth, motor sailing in the beginning of the channel. And then my engine did overheat and I had quite an uncomfortable ride tacking back and forth to get to Sapodilla Bay and drop anchor under sail. Had I really understood the nightly effect that these banks have in a wind prediction under 15 knots, I would have been able to make wiser choices. I checked into the country at Southside Marina and picked up my parts at FedEx.
That is where the trail ends. This is Walk-In Marine, the only marine store in Turks and Caicos. They got a selection of ropes. And they do have quite a bit of paint supplies. Some general stuff like navigation lights over there, and well, a lot of miscellaneous like buttons and locks, padlocks. A selection of fuel filters, some hoses and electrical bilge pumps and some other electrical pumps, a selection of sealants. They have a lot of generic stuff. It's I think about 10 or 20% maximum cheaper as the Bahamas, still fairly pricey. This is the Conch Shack, which is a pretty well-known place here. We're gonna visit now. This is the restaurant area.
About security in the Caribbean, Bruce says the thornless path exposes you to personal assault on your boat or ashore less than many yachting standards in the USA. I always lock the main hatch of my boat when I leave, although I do know many people will leave it open. I used to always haul the dinghy at night on deck, but as I don't have a proper haul out system, I often leave it in the water, always locked to the boat, only not in the Bahamas. If I am unsure, I take the engine off. He also says he has a motion detector that at night will shine a very bright light if someone passes. Because of reading this 2 years ago, I took security at night very serious and also always lock my boat from the inside at night. However, after a year of doing this, I got a lot looser with it because I never had any problems. Of course, always something could happen, but in general, the Caribbean islands are a pretty safe place to go. I continued towards the Dominican Republic, first 40 miles over the Turks and Caicos bank. The weather was light on the day I went and I could sail. Then when I exited the Turks and Caicos bank, many people make a stop for the night at Big Sand Key around waypoint 273. I decided to continue to do an overnight sail. It was a full upwind sail and the best upwind angle I could make was straight towards Luperon. We've talked about Luperon before. Luperon has not yet had a recorded hit from a hurricane. The majority of boaters would decide to stay on their boat in an anchorage on their way to the East Caribbean, go to Luperon. I would say as a beginner, you should go for the safest option possible and plan around June to be on around St. Vincent. If I would do this trip again, I would plan ahead better and leave earlier and for sure not do everything on the last moment like I did. Because I was on a schedule, I decided to skip Luperon and continue to Samana Marina. In the Dominican Republic, when you check into an area, if you want to go with your boat to another area, you first have to go to customs to partly check out. They give you something called a despacho, which basically says you're leaving this area of the Dominican Republic and you can go to the next. And then when you arrive in the next area, you have to go to customs again and partly check into that area. I already had experienced a similar system in Cuba, and I really didn't feel like going through that hassle, so I had decided to go to one place in the Dominican Republic, put the boat in marina and do some land travel from there. Now we have gotten to the coast of the Dominican Republic, we need to talk about sea breezes and land breezes. Number 5 of weather features, sea and land breezes. Basically they are each other's exact opposite. So what is a sea breeze? Let's imagine 1,000 little air balls here. What happens is that during the day, the sun heats up the land. Now hot air rises and leaves behind a low pressure system close to the land. Those air balls rise up, but the air always wants to be equal pressure. So if due to warm air rising away from an area there are less air balls there, it has to be filled back up from another area. That air that rises is being blown out to sea. Now if the sea is colder than the land, that air cools down and that air sinks, and then there will be a lot of air balls in one region called a high pressure, and that high pressure air moves towards the low pressure area to create equal pressure again. And because of this we can have localized wind in a total opposite direction as predicted. A land breeze is the exact same thing but at night and in the opposite direction. At night the land cools down very fast and the sea, which holds heat better than the land, is warmer. And there can be a low pressure area above the surface of the sea. The wind blows then from the islands in the direction of the ocean. When the island has very high mountains, the land breeze can be stronger because of something we call katabatic winds. Because cooling air sinks, wind can flow from higher in the mountain downwards, which can create a stronger land breeze. The strength of the sea or land breeze depends on the air pressure made over the sea or land by the heating and cooling of large masses of land next to large bodies of water. Meaning, in order for there to be a sea or a land breeze, there has to be a large body of land and a large body of water next to it. And besides that, a few other necessities, like there has to be sufficient heating of the land by the sun during the day. Because we need a large body of land, the Bahama and Turks and Caicos banks do not have this, and the heat absorbed by these areas is not enough to either create a sea or a land breeze, but they do give off heat at night, so we can use the nightly that those smaller islands create at night. There are a couple more factors for there to maybe be a land or sea breeze. If the wind is more than 15 knots, the wind generally overpowers the land or sea breeze if we are not on the leeward side of an island. The first time on this trip that we get to an area that can give us a sea or land breeze is right now while sailing north of the Dominican Republic. The weather conditions you are looking for here is less than 15 knots of wind from the east-southeast and without northerly swell predicted. This technique applies to the north and south coast of the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico, however a lot more likely to happen north or south of the Dominican Republic. Puerto Rico has a lot less landmass, and because of that a sea or land breeze is less likely to happen. The second factor is you have to stay close to shore in order to be close enough to get the effects of a sea or land breeze. To stay close enough to get the effects of a sea or land breeze, but to stay far enough from shore to be safe from hazards close to shore, Bruce advises during the day to stay in between 60 and 100 feet depth and between 80 and 120 feet depth in the night. The sea or land breeze will change the direction of the east wind to northeast or southeast wind, and modern sailing yachts sail very good to windward in these light conditions that are created by a sea or land breeze, or when it's very calm can continue on a motor. Whereas along the coast of, for an example, Martinique, when you are sailing along the leeward side, the wind protected side of the island, it is pretty common to have a sea breeze during the day. On the north coast of the Dominican Republic, it is a little less common and thus I would not count on getting one. Let me explain why it is not advised to sail with an east to northeast wind of more than 10 knots during the day. This is because of coastal acceleration. In the night the land is cooler than the ocean, but in the day the land is hotter than the ocean. When the wind comes from the east and thus straight towards land, if the land is hot, because of this it can accelerate the wind close to shore. And when the wind comes in an angle to the land, so from the northeast, it can accelerate it even more. So when the wind is predicted to be 15 knots from the east or northeast above the Dominican Republic, with 3 to 5 foot seas on a nice sunny day, we might experience 20 to 25 knots of wind with 6 to 8 foot seas. The recommendation for the best weather sailing the north coast of the Dominican Republic is to do it at night with a wind prediction of east-southeast under 15 knots, where we hopefully have a land breeze but at least no coastal acceleration. Sailing during the day on the north coast of the Dominican Republic, our strategy is to look for a wind coming from the east to southeast, preferably much less than 15 knots with 3 to 5 foot seas. If it is a very cloudy day, the chance of coastal acceleration is a little less. Of course, if there is a weather system moving over or under us that gives us a more favorable weather to move east, I would take that, but that wasn't at the time when I went. Along the coast of the Dominican Republic during the day, I have motor sailed a lot. And as you see here, in the evening I had a land breeze which turned the wind northeast and I could sail. I arrived at night at the Samana Marina. Not ideal, but life is not always ideal. I dropped anchor close to the marina and entered the marina in the morning.
I have a little light where I can shine with. Oh, now it's working again. Again, normally I would do everything to try to avoid this. In the distance you see the green and the red light. That's where I need to point on. Just dropped anchor. I hope I'm not too close to shore. It's actually a 5-star resort that also has this marina. I pay, the monthly rates are 60 cents per foot, 90 cents for the weekly rates, and I think $1.10 per foot per day if you just do a daily price. First impression is, it looks pretty damn awesome.
As I didn't understood all the rules for sailing against the wind at the time and had made countless mistakes on the way, when I arrived in Samana, I was tired. It often hadn't been a fun trip at all. It often had felt more like a survival trip than a fun trip, especially doing it all solo. I put the boat for a couple weeks in the marina. I needed a break. And again, I hope that this video, where I do talk about all the rules for sailing east and all the weather features we can use to our advantage, that you are going to have an easier time than I did. Let's go explore the Dominican Republic.
This is the harbor at Samana town. This is the colonial zone or historic center of the city.
At the marina in Samana, I filled up water and did laundry. And the winning daily chore of today is laundry. From here we're going to continue getting ready to cross the Mona Channel. Bruce's strategy advice is that if there happens to be a calm in which you can motor sail, do it. But in prevailing wind conditions, look for a window of 36 to 48 hours of easterly wind under 15 knots. Of course, if there's a weather system passing that makes our wind direction more favorable, please take it. The strategy is to leave Samana when the sun is almost down to make use of the land breeze effect that will calm down the sea here at night. Then sail or motor sail across the bay and keep hugging the coast until you have a somewhat straight shot to Mona Island. I was in a hurry and instead of stopping at Mona Island, I decided to keep going. I was south of Mona Island when the sun came up and the trade winds became very strong and I was bashing very slowly into the waves. My sail ripped and the bracket of my alternator broke and I had to divert my route to Boquerón to fix all this before continuing. What I should have done was stopping at Mona Island because in the night the west side of Puerto Rico gives up its heat just like the Bahama banks and Turks and Caicos bank do. It creates a barrier against the trade winds and I would have had a much more comfortable ride to the west coast of Puerto Rico. I arrived in Boquerón to have my sail fixed and to have a new alternator bracket made. Above the Dominican Republic, it is pretty likely to get wind from an east-southeast direction. On Puerto Rico, it is a lot less likely to get wind from an east-northeast direction and much more likely for the wind to be east to southeast, and thus it can easily have coastal acceleration during the day. Thus will our strategy for sailing the south coast of Puerto Rico be different in order not to wait forever to continue. Because if the wind during the day is 15 knots from the east-southeast, the wind close to shore can be accelerated to 20 to 25 knots, which can lead to quite unpleasant situations. Sailing south on Puerto Rico, a different strategy is advised. As the Puerto Rican coast has less landmass than the Dominican Republic, there's less chance of a sea or a land breeze. As most of us try to do these trips mostly during the day, the strategy here is to choose a day when the wind is the prevailing east-southeast wind, but under 15 knots with 3 to 5 foot seas, and lift anchor just before the sun comes up or as much time before the sun comes up as you are comfortable doing it. It takes a few hours before the sun gets up to strength and creates those strong trade winds which Puerto Rico is famous for during late morning until late afternoon. This gives us time to sail for a couple hours at most to the next anchorage. I left Boquerón on the west coast of Puerto Rico at night and I sailed in one go to the east side of Puerto Rico to the marina of Palmas del Mar. Because, as you know, I was on a time schedule, not very smart. Sailing during the night and early in the morning was doable, but from late in the morning until early in the evening, it became so miserable that during those hours, I think my average speed was about 1.5 knots. I should have followed the rules from the book that I barely understood at the time. Because I kept going and did not wait for weather, I ended up having a miserable ride during the day where lots of stuff on the boat broke because I was pounding so hard against the waves. I'm not doing that again next time. I made one more stop in Puerto Rico. Because I want to help you guys as much as I can, at this moment you understand the strategies for continuing sailing east. All the other stops that you see here on the navigation are the exact stops where Keith, a friend of mine, stopped, who did it smarter than me and was here earlier in the season. I continued straight to Marina Palmas del Mar at waypoint 360. In Palmas del Mar I bought more fuel. I slept for a few hours during the day when I was on the dock. And late in the afternoon I continued on a straight run to Grenada as it was late July already. I was late and I didn't have time to explore more. After leaving Marina Palmas del Mar, I shut off the engine, and when I needed it again on the way, it wouldn't start anymore and I couldn't figure out what the problem was. I sailed a couple days to Carriacou, Grenada, where there's a big bay to enter. And when arriving in Carriacou, I sailed past some of the boats who were anchored on the outside of the bay and asked if they could tow me in by dinghy. Further outside of the bay, it was too deep for me to anchor, and I also didn't want to sail in between the other boats at sunset while I was quite tired to find a place to drop anchor under sail. I fixed the engine there and continued sailing the East Caribbean. More about that in a video I recently made about how to sail the East Caribbean. If you arrive on the east side of Puerto Rico earlier in the season, I have made a suggested route through the USVI and BVI to Sint Maarten that you can follow if you wish. Of course, by the time you get here, you are so experienced that you can make your own choices. In the book he says, failure to wait patiently for a good weather window overwhelmingly contributes to unhappy cruises. Yet patience hardly hallmarks many cruisers, as most are strong-willed, self-confident, and skippers tend to take charge easily. This is exactly where most of my difficulties in my trip came from. When I wanted to go, I wanted to go. I had finished a video for YouTube and it was time to start on the next one, and that was not always the right choice. Bruce describes it like this: waiting for weather, getting all set to go, then having to sit in port day after day, unable to go out, unable to schedule anything, just waiting on a bus that never seems to come. Then when the window opens, they jump at it immediately. They take the first hours of a 3-day window. The swell's still up, the wind's not yet laid down, then they sit in the next anchorage for the best part of the window. One thing I personally found difficult in the first year of owning my boat is that when I was waiting for weather and I saw other people leave, I got anxious and often left too. And many of those times it was still not a good time to leave. Another thing he mentions is that if people come visit you, they can either choose the date or the place, but not both. Because sailing is so dependent on weather, the last thing you want to do as a boat owner is sailing on a tight schedule. I've done it many times and it almost always turns out to be a very uncomfortable trip. Also, if you can't make the tidy daylight landfall suggested here, or you just feel uncomfortable with an entrance under some conditions, stand way out to sea, wait and go below in watches, assuming you're not doing it solo like I did, and then go in at daylight. Before finishing this video, I would like to show you 2 short interviews of 2 sailor friends of mine. Peter, who did the I-65 sailing route on his Beneteau 50, and Keith, who did a similar route as me.
Hey ho, this is Peter on Bakwa. Bakwa is a 2008 Beneteau Oceanis 50. And you were asking me about my passage from Bahamas to San Martin, which is in Eastern Caribbean. Well, I took the I-65 route, which takes you basically through the Atlantic Ocean, and it took me about 10 days. I went from Nassau to Spanish Wells, cleared out over there, and then sailed halfway to Bermuda, and then turned southeast. Yeah, it's for me it was extremely lucky because the weather was actually very nice. I always had a wind at about 60, sometimes 70 degree angle. I was buddy boating with a catamaran that didn't have that much luck. For him it was very difficult to sail into that to that angle, so he was constantly motoring. He spent about $2,000 in fuel for that passage. For me, I was only turning the engines on for, well, one engine on for the night, because I was still running on the old running down AGM batteries, so either way I had to have the engine on to recharge them at night, because my autopilot would basically drain the batteries. So another reason for that was that because I was buddy boating with that other boat and he had to motor the entire time, I had my sails trimmed to very small state, and had to adjust my speed based on his, and it was very difficult to track him because his navigation lights were very non-existent. He only had one light in the back, so yes, and no AIS. Yeah, it was that was the most difficult part of the trip. Otherwise, we are extremely lucky with the weather. Had maybe 1 or 2 squalls, but they were very short and very light. And yeah, that was basically it. That was the passage. I did have Predict Wind and Iridium Go on board, so I kept checking the weather 3 times a day and making sure that we're going in the right direction without any weather systems hitting us. But if there was anything else that I would do differently, I would definitely pick a boat that is similar speed to mine, just so this trip could be done faster, because I think I could easily do it in 7 days instead of 10. And another thing would be having a crew member that could actually take some shifts, because throughout the 10 days I slept about 18 hours, and of course had some 15-minute naps, but you know, you never actually get that much rest from those. So your question about paper charts, no, I have not used them. I have 2 or 3 GPS devices that I constantly check and maintain, and have backup to them, so didn't have to use paper charts. Plus, I mean, I was going through the Atlantic, so even with just regular GPS, or not GPS, normal compass, that would work. Yeah, I think I covered everything from your questions. So yeah, hope that helps you. Cheers.
I have a 1979 Pearson 424 that's been converted to an electric. We, as in me and Becca, double-handed the boat from Texas down to Guatemala for the first hurricane season, and then went from Guatemala directly east to Martinique, and we did it via this route: Guatemala to the Bay Islands, Bay Islands to Jamaica, Jamaica to Hispaniola, Haiti to DR, and then Hispaniola to Puerto Rico, Puerto Rico to the USVIs, USVIs then to Martinique. All told, it was about 5,000 nautical miles we sailed. It was only about 2,500 to 3,000 miles as the crow flies. The extra mileage we sailed was due to the trigonometry of, you know, a cruising sailboat being able to go 45 degrees on a heading at best, you know, these kind of boats, and then, but that's fine, but then you got, when you're going against the wind and the wave, you get current and wave and wind all working against you, and you will drift an extra 10 to 15 degrees, and you'll be 60 degrees off the wind. And if you want to sail 100 miles straight east, it will take you 200 miles to do that if you're sailing 60 degrees course over ground on either tack. And that's what we had to do. It was tough. It was very tough. It was very tough on us. We became better sailors. I was a seasoned sailor, but I was a downwind sailor, so this was my first real experience with upwind sailing. It was a different world. It's a different ball game. I would equate it to One being able to drive a NASCAR car when you're going downwind, and then turning and going upwind is like the equivalent of trying to drive an 18-wheeler through the mountains. It's just really, it's a different set of challenges. Not that either one is more or less challenging, I guess, but that's not true. Upwind sailing is more challenging. It's a lot harder to go upwind sailing. I think anyone that tells you otherwise is probably has not done a lot of upwind sailing. Anything else I wish others would know, or anything we would have known? We beat the boat up. It was really hard on the boat. It was hard on us. We struggled with, moving the boat really hard. And the boat, every move we did for the first 9 months was all about weather and trying to take the least painful path we could. We generally did not go out in less than 15, and usually it was 20 knots. And I mean, 20 knots on the nose true is 25 knots apparent, right? That's another thing that's really important to know, is the difference between true wind and apparent wind. And if you got 15 knots and you're going downwind, that turns into 10 knots. If you got 15 knots and you're going upwind, that turns into 20 knots. And it's a different world in terms of the canvas you have to have up and your ability to move. We are an electric boat, so we don't really motor the same way. We really can't motor. We can't just motor through it. We definitely have like an auxiliary motor, but we can use it in motor assist, and so we can point a little better than a cruising boat. All things being equal, we can point a little better than another boat of this era that doesn't have the electric motor, because we can spin the prop at a slow speed without using any energy. And so that helps us, but we really had to sail this whole way. And so having to sail that whole way makes you better sailors, and you get good with it, it beats your equipment up. So we're glad we made it over to the Eastern Caribbean, but we've enjoyed the last year of more or less beam reach sailing. And there are challenges of being in the Eastern Caribbean and sailing, but those challenges pale in comparison to actually getting to the Eastern Caribbean from the East Coast of either Central America or America. Hope that helps, Soup, and all the best.
And so I arrived in the East Caribbean. Like I said, I made another video where I put all the information in about how to sail the East Caribbean. I'll add a link in the description of this video and at the end of this video. I've tried to bundle all the important things about this trip in this video. A few things I haven't talked about, like how to deal with hurricanes and also about anchoring. If you'd like to know more about that, that's in the video New Sailboat Owners First Year Full-Time Sailing the Caribbean. I'll also add a link to that video in the description of this video. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'd like to thank my patrons for supporting me so that I can still make these videos. And before ending this video, I'd like to say again, if I could do this with no sailing experience before my 30th birthday, then you can do it too.